Hello, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for coming. I am sure that there are far more exciting and thrilling things you could be doing at Big Sound rather than nerding out over data with me. Lock the doors so no one can leave now, please. So, my name is Liv Buli. I am the data journalist at a music analytics company called Next Big Sound, and we are based in New York City. And basically what we do is we provide an analytics platform to artists, managers, labels, agencies that allows them to centralize all of the data that they use in their day-to-day to understand what's going on with the artists that they work with. So this is everything from social data, streaming data, sales data, and more. So my role at the company is to take advantage of this data set to write interesting articles about what's going on in the industry, artists that are up and coming, and every now and then a data-driven perspective on why everybody wants to see Miley Cyrus twerk. So, today I want to cover 3 different topics with you. I'd like to start with explaining to you kind of the overwhelming size of data that we're looking at and what some of the value it lies in using that data to make smarter decisions. Second, I want to talk you through a couple of the research projects that we've been working on recently that show you how we can slice and dice this data in interesting ways to answer questions that haven't been answered before in the industry. And then finally, I would like to show you a few Australian case studies to show you how you could use this data on a daily basis to make your decisions. So far in 2014, we have tracked close to 260 billion online plays. This is from sources including Spotify, YouTube, Vivo, Rdio, SoundCloud, and more. This is an overwhelmingly large number, and it's also an increase of 78% compared to the 145 billion online plays that we tracked last year. And that number, again, was also an increase from the year before. So what we're seeing is that these numbers are increasing year over year at a rapid clip. As for social reach, we tracked about 8 billion new fans added so far this year. Again, this is an increase from what we had tracked last year, which was about 3.4 billion fans added in that same time period, and that's an increase of 135%. So we estimate that somewhere around 2.1% of all of this online activity is coming from Australia. That may not sound like a very large number, but if you do some rough math on that, that's about 5 billion online plays, which is actually quite a vast amount of activity. And resulting from that vast amount of activity is a large amount of data that can be useful in our day-to-day work in the music industry. So this industry is no stranger to data, actually. Sales, radio spins, these are numbers that we've been looking at for years in order to measure and predict success, to determine promotional spending, and to make other business decisions throughout the industry. What has changed is the amount of data that's available. So now with all of this online activity occurring, we can answer a lot more questions than we used to be able to, and we can do it with a much higher level of accuracy. So the way I like to explain the data that I work with, particularly in the music industry, is a creative industry, and a lot of it is about hunches and traditions and the way you know something will work. The data that I work with will bring you 99% of the way there. It can help you narrow that pool of prospective artists from the hundreds of thousands of artists that we track every day to a few that are popping and are really interesting and who you should go look at. Or it can help you decide which way you should run a campaign. It can steer you in the right direction. But at the end of the day, it's a creative industry. And unless you have an ear for music, unless you know that this is great, you're never ever going to be successful. So in other words, you need to know what kind of brick you want to build using this clay. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the research projects that we've been working on. We took a look at audience demographics for the hundreds of thousands of artists that we're tracking in Next Big Sound and found a very interesting phenomenon. For the typical artist, 67%, or 2/3 of their audience, is a millennial. So this is people ages 18 to 34. It's a pretty interesting number. First of all, this is a great generation to be resonating with. Part of the reason could be that this generation is who is using these services more so than previous generations. The pattern is true for both males and females. So if you see there, the median number for audience proportion that is made up of millennials is 67%. But what we found was if we isolated just the artists that are moving the fastest in the Next Big Sound database, that number, the audience skews closer to millennials, and it's about 75%. So why is demographic data important? Well, it's invaluable for you to understand who your audience is or who your artist's audience is. And online audience data is some of the most accurate and immediate data that you can get about this. So imagine that you're trying to figure out the audience demographics of 5 Seconds of Summer or One Direction. And you decide that you're going to use ticket sales data and credit card information to determine what their audience looks like. Who do you think is buying those tickets? Most likely, it's the parents of the 13-year-old girls buying these tickets. So when you then determine that the biggest portion of audience for One Direction or 5 Seconds of Summer is males age 40 to 60, you're probably not completely accurate. And the reason, one of the great use cases for this kind of information is part of this rise in or this increase in brand artist partnerships. So as the music industry searches for ancillary revenue streams beyond sales, one of the things that's happening is that we're seeing that artists are working with brands a lot more to build their presence. And if you are able to narrow or figure out exactly what your audience is and go to any brand and say, hey, this is the audience you are going to reach if you work with me, if you sponsor my tour, if you otherwise support my career. These are the people that are going to hear about you and they're going to be loyal to your brand. Well, that is a much larger bargaining chip in a boardroom than I make great music. So what about other promotional events? I wanted to take a little bit of a look at, is there a way to concretely measure the impact of things like the coveted iTunes Single of the Week? So I took 30 artists that had an iTunes single featured as an iTunes Single of the Week, and I compared that to a sample group of artists who hadn't. I looked at the 7 days leading up to the date of the iTunes Single of the Week and the 2 days after, and calculated what was the difference in the average lift for these artists across social metrics. So what I was looking for with this test was to see that the probability of that difference being able to observe that difference being less than 5% if you were to look at daily fluctuations in activity. I found that for most social metrics, there is in fact an increase. And not only is it statistically significant, meaning that there's less than a 5% chance that you would be able to observe this if you were looking at daily activity and regular fluctuations, but in addition to that, it's also practically significant. So an increase of, say, 90% in the average number of new Twitter followers added at the same time that you're having an iTunes Single of the Week, or an increase of 196% in Twitter mentions correlating to the same time that you're doing an iTunes Single of the Week. The only metric I didn't find a correlation with, or it's not statistically viable for me to say that there's a correlation with, is Instagram, where there was a 4% difference in mean and a 97% chance that I'd be able to observe that difference if I was looking at daily activity. But in general, it's a pretty positive view on how this kind of works together. You can take that one step further and use something called earned media value, which is the cost or the price that you would have to pay in order to buy a similar number of social impressions. So if you were to calculate a value for this increase and compare that to a different time period of baseline activity, you would be able to isolate the impact of this campaign and put a monetary value on the social impressions that you received at the same time that you were doing an iTunes Single of the Week. So this portion of the talk is going to be relevant to the panel that's coming up about songs and what's, features of songs. And one of the things that we did was we took a look at the properties of songs and how that correlates to sales. The data that we use, or the properties that we use, came from EchoNest, who were recently purchased by Spotify. And we put this in context with sales from iTunes. And if you look at the diagram above, you'll see that there are all these different features, so liveness, loudness, duration, danceability. And where the dark blue spots are indicate that there are features where there are ranges where sales are maximized. So, for instance, most songs that are, the most number of songs that are sold are between 3 minutes and 4.5 minutes long. The relationship between these features and sales is not linear, meaning that there is a level at which, so say a certain level of danceability will help increase your sales. But as soon as you hit the point at which this is too much, sales drop again. So in order to be able to kind of engineer that perfect song, you have to find a balance in between, these ranges in which all of this is maximized. And so there are a few kind of key pieces of advice that we can give as a result of this research project. Any song that's less than 2.5 minutes does not sell well. A track needs to be loud to get noticed, and for more information on that, I suggest you look up Paul Lemire and Music Machinery, and he kind of started this conversation about how getting the attention of your audience is key to selling well. Another thing that sounds a little bit vague, but there are measurable ways of measuring this, you have to be wary of making your track either too happy or too acoustic. So there are some great examples of songs that I've listed here that really kind of hit the mark on all of these things, and as you probably know, all of these songs have sold pretty darn well. So Bruno Mars, Calvin Harris, and Passion Pit. So I wanted then to step back a little bit and look at Australian artists I'm sure most of you are all very familiar with, but these things that I presented before here were kind of a little bit more in-depth research projects. And I wanted to show you how you can use this platform and this information in day-to-day work and not necessarily have to do a massive research project to answer a question. Did I do that? I broke it. There we go. So we're going to take a look at Flume, The Preachers, and Vance Joy, and basically look at how I would look at these people in the platform and what kind of information I could glean from the graphs that I'm making. So Flume's self-titled debut album, Flume, was released in November 2012 here in Australia. It hit the ARIA charts on November 25th, 2012. It spent 65 weeks on the chart, and it peaked at number 1. The same album did not hit Billboard's electronic and dance albums chart until March 2014. And so what I did was I graphed SoundCloud activity, which is the blue section, for November 2012, against SoundCloud activity for March 2012, which is the red section. As you can see, you're seeing a much higher level of activity once that album has started to reach charts in the United States. Similarly, he recently sold out 3 nights in a row at Terminal 5, which most of you know is a pretty big feat in New York City. And so I wanted to look at Facebook activity for back then compared to now. And you see, again, that the level of Facebook activity is much higher now than it was before, when he was much more popular just locally in Australia. This kind of increase is not surprising and is actually what you should be looking for, because we find that most artist popularity tends to increase by the rule of proportionate growth, meaning the more you have, the more you get. And if you're not seeing that kind of activity with an artist, you have a problem on your hands. This brings me to my next case study, which is The Preachers. So I wanted to show you how you can take some of this online activity and kind of determine whether or not an artist is ready to break in other markets than just in Australia. So The Preachers are starting to make some ripples internationally. They performed a set at Bonnaroo this year. They won Rolling Stone's Music Video of the Year. And as you can see, from the beginning of 2014, all of a sudden, activity outside of Australia starts to make up a larger portion of their overall online activity. The barrier to entry when it comes to consuming someone's music is much lower now that everything's available online. So you can see quite early on whether or not somebody is resonating in any given market that you choose to look at using this data, and decide whether or not it's time to route a tour there, or release the album there, or see whether or not they're ready to break outside of the Australian market. Another thing I wanted to show you that I think is a very fun thing you can play around with is track level analysis. So Vance Joy has obviously risen to popularity with the track Riptide. This is like gone overseas. His name is pretty well known at this point, and he's about to release next week, I believe it is, his album in Australia and the UK. But when you use track level analysis, you're able to determine with more accuracy than just a hunch which track off of that album should be the next single to promote for Vance Joy. So everyone's already heard Riptide at this point, and if you look at this, this is a comparison of the 4 tracks off of his EP. You see that Riptide obviously has a much higher level of activity, but also From Afar, which is the blue line that you see, resonates a little bit more than other tracks from Vance Joy. So this is a way that you could, one of the hunches that I talked about earlier, often when an artist is releasing an album, you have an idea of what track you would like to be the single off of that album, and for whatever reason that is. With this data available to you, you're able to go in and take a look at the activity and determine whether or not this is actually the song that's resonating most with his audience. So I wanted to leave you with kind of a final thought about the idea of using data when it comes to music and what we work with. The problem with data often is that it's pretty easy to manipulate. So these hunches and ideas and traditions that I've been talking about, the way people typically run the music industry, to be honest, it would be fairly easy to manipulate the data to corroborate whatever hunch or idea that you have. The best way to approach data is to ask questions of it and accept the answers that it gives back to you. As opposed to saying, if you were to just look at a portion of something instead of the whole picture, you might be able to make a use case for one thing because that is what you would like. But if you use the data in a fair, representative manner, you're able to answer questions and actually make smarter business decisions. It's not going to be helpful to either you or to your artist or whoever is using this data if you are manipulating it in some way. So just to kind of leave you with, I don't know if you noticed my second of 2 Sherlock Holmes quotes, not at all geeking out over Sherlock lately. But it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. So remember, always ask questions of the data and then accept the answers it has to give you. It doesn't mean that you can't work within and massage a certain area of an artist's career to try to stimulate things to go faster or for someone to grow more in a particular region, but the data is always telling you exactly what is going on. So, with that, I'd like to, again, thank you all for coming. I would like to thank Big Sound and Key Music for bringing me here so I could talk to you guys about this a little bit. And I would like to thank you very much for sitting through my somewhat boring statistical conversation about the music industry. So, thank you very much.